Hello again. Let's take a little look at the bass guitar in this particular track. So it's not uncommon these days to find a bass guitar with a lot of processing on it. I mostly sort of distortion processing these days. I find quite a lot of bass players do that, but even increasingly recently, bass players coming in with very big and complex pedal boards. So there's a few things you need to do to accommodate those sometimes, and maybe in this I can kind of show you some of the things you need to do. I've added additional processing. It's something that went on late in this mix, just to bring the bass guitar sort of more characteristically in line with the other guitar information. As I've mentioned in the intro, the guitars are processed and very sort of semi-synthetic sounding anyway by design from Mark, the guitarist and singer. So the bass, as well as the distortion, I wanted to create a little more synthetic sort of tone to it, overtone to it, and I'll kind of explain how I did that. Let me play you it in the track first. And here it is in isolation. Let's take out the room sound for a second and maybe have a look at the individual components first. This is the DI sound on its own. Let me quickly mute those yet again. And sorry, excuse me. Getting a bit fumbly with my mutes and solos. So the DI is a DI. It's an active bass. It's got a kind of scooped, pre-scooped kind of tone. I found it to be quite poppy as well. So there's a little bit of work done to try and tame in. It's been heavily compressed several times to bring in that transient or tame that transient, and add a little bit of low back. So there's a nice clean low to the DI, which I liked, which is common again to active basses. This is the bass rig tone, so this is the bass amp. It was an Ampeg SVT VR, the big bad boy with the 8x10 cab at Brighton Electric. And again, this was also recorded with, let me play you the room sounds as well on top of this. So this was the rig in the with the distortion added to it. That's created with a trick I may have mentioned before. It's a Kurt Ballou thing, where the signal is split with an ABY. It's from the bass guitar, split into two. One of those signals, because the Ampeg has two channels which can be used simultaneously, you can actually set volumes and create a small mix in the head of this amp. One channel is much more clean, so that the bass and the low end is clean, and then the second channel has this distortion tone on top of it, which is blended in on the amp. The reason for doing that is that most distortion pedals roll off the bottom end. Low frequency distortion isn't as pleasant. It can be kind of farty and not very nice. Nasty sort of square wavy sort of distortion. It's kind of uncontrollable. So a lot of distortion pedals will tend to only distort the top end. So this is a way to get a clean low end with the distortion on the top that you want. It still wasn't quite enough. Actually, before we do this next channel, let me play the room sounds on top. So this is the room pairing, the AKG long pair that we had on the drums as well. That's just to give the bass some width and some drama. Just creating a wider bass for the low end in the mix. So the DI and the rig and the room sound like this. Okay. It still needed some sub control. This is a trick that I have mentioned in our BIM lessons, and this is a parallel sub. So the signal from the amp is copied off, the low frequencies are left and boosted into a compressor just to give some low frequency sustain. That on its own sounds like this. Okay, added together gives a much more consistent low energy to the bass guitar. I've mentioned this, I know I have, that the bass guitar is flawed in design. Its role is to supply bass, but in modern terms it doesn't supply the kind of sustained and controlled and consistent low frequency energy that we've all become used to from electronic music. So on the bus there is an EQ, which is just scooping out some of the woolly kind of 300. It's actually 250 in this. It's a little bit lower in this one because it's tuned a little low. That's on, scooping some out. I'm then putting this into a favoured tape plugin of mine, Oxide by UAD. You might have noticed that that's actually killed a little of the low end that was naturally there. That's downside to it. Pushing into tape will kind of extend and exaggerate the high frequency energy. I wanted to kind of even out this distortion that's on the bass, and a little low energy is lost along the way. I will compensate for that in the hardware EQ that follows, so bear with. But it's already beginning to even out the energy. That then goes into this hardware chain, which is a couple of nice vintage units and a valve unit that I have. So the first thing is a vintage Yuri parametric EQ. This is just got, I think I've had this for sort of 3 or 4 years now, and I can't say that I've ever used it on anything other than bass. It is my favourite EQ on bass, especially bass guitars. Something harmonically added, and I try not to use the word fat too often in that sense, the PHAT from the 90s and noughties, but it really does fatten up the bass in that sense, that bass fatness. So it's not that expensive a box either. It's just not, they're not so easy to find now. That's then fed into a Culture Vulture, which is a valve harmonic enhancer. This unit up here, it's battered. I've had this for 15 years or so, maybe nearly 20 years now. It is great. It just adds a harmonic content from the valves, just giving the bass extra range and fullness. That's then fed into a DBX 160 VU, which is another vintage compressor. It has a great attack on low frequencies. It can be a bit noisy, but it's fine if you gate it, and you can see that hardware insert return is here, and it comes back into a gate. I like this gatey weighty. I'm not happy about saying gatey weighty so often, but that's what Boz decided to call their gate. I really like it. It sounds like I think I've said before in this particular set of videos, a Drama DS201 in the way that it opens and attacks. So with the attack set quick, it has an additional snap to things, which adds a good impact. I like this. So this is the difference between the hardware chain inserted and not inserted. So this is without first, and with, and there's that low frequency energy I've added back in with that hardware EQ. I really do like that EQ for that. So yeah, the tape has taken a little low out, and I've added it back in with this hardware EQ. Then also decided I wanted more sustain. This was after I had printed this hardware insert. This track actually sort of came back for a second mix. I decided I wanted to remix it again. There was a pause from finishing this initially to its release due to a membership change in the band and other reasons. And on reflection, I just wanted a little bit more sustain than I'd already generated in the bass, just to add gravitas again to the mix. So this has got a parallel multiband compressor. It has a boosted low, which is then sort of held down. It's boosting with EQ and then trapping in with compression the low frequency energy. That sounds like this. just adding consistency to the low. And then this particular range here, I'd have to show you this with the whole mix open. This is sidechain to the vocal. Something I noticed a little while back, that quite often the bass guitar, once the sustain has been added, can start to smother and mask the low frequency or the lower frequency information in a vocal. Kind of the chesty kind of weight to the vocal, especially the male vocal, makes it sound very thin. So what I've done is I've allowed this area of frequencies, which aren't so pleasant on the bass, to be taken back by the vocal. So that responds and sidechains to the vocal, allowing the vocal to keep its prominence in that low mid area. There's another compressor afterwards, and this is working quite hard as well. And again, that is to counter this low frequency boost that I've added here. And again, the whole thing is sidechained to the kick drum. Okay, one last thing to talk about on the bass guitar, that's the additional stuff I did to the room sounds. There's a high pass on the EQ. I didn't want too much low rumbling around in the wides. That's just bad for mastering. This phase came late. I just felt once everything else was processed, the guitars were where they were in the mix, that the bass needed to sound a little more synthetic, and rather than adding it to the dry signal in the middle, I opted for adding it to the room sounds, because I felt I could be more extreme adding modulation to it. So this is without. I'll add this back into the mix, the room sound. So adding a bit of width to the tone, to the signal, giving it a bit of gravitas, as I said, and now adding some modulation just to give it a synthetic feel. And just to even it out, because modulating low energy can push and pull the energy in this, in perception. I've added a pretty extreme compressor to really bring out the swooshy swashy sort of phase sound. And again, that is sidechained to the kick drum, just to make sure that stays out of the way of the GUI's not working particularly well on that one at the moment. Let me try and reset it. No, you see it a bit better now. It's a little problem that Wave Factory need to sort out on that GUI. I'm not quite sure what that is, but anyway, that's the bass guitar in total. Next up, we'll look at the guitars.